That flawless emerald-cut diamond, catching the boutique's velvet lighting, was exactly the one Crystal had pointed out to David a decade ago. Back then, they were standing outside a rain-streaked shop window, sharing a cheap umbrella and a lukewarm cup of coffee. David had pressed his forehead against her temple and sworn that one day he would put that exact ring on her finger. Now, 10 years later, he was keeping that promise. Only, the finger belonged to a girl who looked barely old enough to rent a car. Crystal stood perfectly still behind a massive marble pillar in the high-end jewelry store, her breath trapped somewhere between her lungs and her throat. The girl, who had the kind of bouncy, effortless youth that cost a fortune in maintenance, held her hand up to the light, giggling as the diamond refracted a rainbow of colors across the pristine glass counter. "Do you really think it's not too much?" the girl asked, her voice coated in a sugary, manufactured innocence. David wrapped his arms around her tiny waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. The man Crystal had loved since she was 22, the man whose tech empire she had quietly built from their cramped studio apartment, let out a low, indulgent laugh. There is a specific brand of amnesia that strikes men the moment they reach the top floor. David laughs at the idea of Crystal wearing a diamond, calling her bland as tap water, entirely forgetting that she was the one who sold her grandmother's heirlooms to make his payroll. He views her as a utility, reliable, transparent, and taken for granted. He's looking for sparkle in a 22-year-old because he's already drained the life out of the woman who fueled his ascent. But David's mistake is a common one. He confuses Crystal's stillness for lack of depth. He forgets that while tap water is boring, a tsunami is just water with a change in momentum. "Nothing is too much for you, baby," David purred, kissing the side of the girl's neck. "Besides, you make it look alive. If I put this on my wife, it would just look like glass. She's as bland as tap water." Bland as tap water. If heartbreak had a sound, it wouldn't be a shatter. It would be the dull, sickening thud of something vital hitting the floor. For a fleeting second, a wave of pure, unadulterated grief threatened to bring Crystal to her knees. This was the man she had sacrificed her 20s for. When his startup was bleeding money, it was Crystal who quietly sold her own grandmother's antique jewelry to make payroll. When his arrogant old money mother had looked down her nose at Crystal's middle-class background, it was Crystal who swallowed her pride, learned the ins and outs of high society etiquette, and played the perfect accommodating daughter-in-law to secure David's inheritance. She had paused her own thriving interior design career to become the invisible architect of his success. And now, in the glowing warmth of a Tuesday afternoon, she was nothing more than tap water. A lesser woman might have stepped out from behind the marble pillar. A lesser woman might have screamed, slapped the girl, thrown a scene fit for a reality television show, and demanded to know why. But Crystal was not a lesser woman. She was 32, fiercely intelligent, and possessed a spine forged from steel. The hot tears that pricked the corners of her eyes never fell. Instead, the blinding pain in her chest rapidly crystallized into something else, something entirely cold, sharp, and terribly clear. Crying was the most useless currency in the world, and Crystal had never been one to make a bad investment. With a steady hand, she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her phone. She angled the camera perfectly, ensuring the glare of the display cases didn't obscure the shot. She hit record. The high-definition lens captured everything: the intimate touches, the sparkling ring, the transaction at the register, and the moment David handed over the sleek black credit card, the joint credit card. The audacity of it was almost poetic. She recorded for 3 full minutes. Once she had enough to ensure no lawyer in the country could argue it was a misunderstanding, she stopped the recording, uploaded it to a secure cloud drive, and slipped the phone back into her purse. She didn't linger to watch them leave. Stepping out of the boutique's heavy glass doors, the crisp, biting city air hit her face. The sun was shining brightly, tourists were laughing on the sidewalks, and traffic was humming its usual chaotic tune. The world hadn't stopped spinning just because her marriage had died. Crystal took a deep, shuddering breath, filling her lungs with the chilling breeze. It cleared the last remnants of suffocating fog from her brain. When she arrived back at their sprawling, impeccably decorated estate in the suburbs, the silence of the house was deafening. Every piece of furniture, every carefully curated piece of art, was a testament to her taste, her effort, her life. It looked like a spread in an architectural magazine, but to Crystal, it suddenly looked like a beautifully staged tomb. She walked into the grand kitchen, poured herself a glass of ice water. The cold liquid sliding down her throat felt like an awakening. David thought she was tap water. Fine. He was about to find out that water could turn into a tsunami. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't smash his framed awards or shred his custom-tailored suits. Instead, she walked upstairs, took a long, hot shower, applied her most expensive night cream, and slipped into bed, wearing a silk nightgown that felt like liquid armor against her skin. It was past midnight when she finally heard the faint hum of his sports car pulling into the driveway. The front door clicked open and shut. Heavy footsteps padded up the carpeted stairs. The bedroom door creaked, and a sliver of hallway light cut across the dark room. Crystal kept her breathing even, her eyes closed, feigning a deep sleep. The mattress dipped as David climbed in. He leaned over, and the cloying, unmistakable scent of a sweet, cheap vanilla perfume washed over her, cutting through the smell of his expensive cologne. He pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "Good night, my perfect, quiet wife," he whispered into the dark. David rolled over and was snoring within minutes, completely oblivious to the monster he had just created. In the pitch black of the bedroom, Crystal's eyes snapped open. She stared at the ceiling, the ghost of his kiss burning like acid on her skin. Slowly, the corners of her mouth tipped upward into a smile. It was a beautiful, terrifying smile that could have frozen hell itself. "Sleep well, David," she thought, pulling the heavy duvet up to her chin. "It's the last peaceful night you're ever going to have." The next morning began like a perfectly choreographed play. Crystal woke up at 6, brewed David's hyper-specific artisanal coffee, and laid out his charcoal gray suit. When he finally strolled into the kitchen, checking his phone with a self-important frown, she handed him his mug with a practiced, serene smile. "Morning, honey," David said, barely glancing up. He took a sip and sighed in satisfaction. "You always make it exactly how I like it. I don't know what I'd do without you, Crystal." "You're about to find out," she thought, her smile not faltering an inch. She watched him leave for the office, his ego practically taking up the entire driveway. The moment his taillights disappeared around the bend, Crystal's demeanor shifted. The compliant, perfect wife vanished, replaced by a woman on a very tight, very lethal schedule. David had always underestimated her. Because she didn't attend the flashy board meetings or stand on stages giving TED Talks, he had somehow convinced himself that he was the sole mastermind behind his company's success. He conveniently forgot who had written the initial business plan. He forgot who had negotiated their first seed funding. Most importantly, he forgot that Crystal was the one who set up their entire financial infrastructure. She walked into his home office, a room she supposedly only entered to dust the bookshelves. She booted up his desktop. He hadn't changed his master password in 5 years. For the next 4 hours, Crystal didn't move. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she downloaded terabytes of data onto encrypted hard drives. She pulled every tax return, every offshore account record, and every hidden ledger. David was brilliant with code, but he was notoriously sloppy with money. As she dug deeper, the sheer volume of his betrayal unfolded in stark, glaring numbers. There it was, a monthly transfer of $15,000 to an account under the name Mia Harper. There was the receipt for a brand new luxury SUV. And then, the final twist of the knife, a recent down payment of $500,000 for a penthouse downtown. Crystal stared at the screen, her jaw tight. The down payment had been pulled from a high-yield savings account they had specifically set aside for their future children. A cold fury settled into her bones, eradicating whatever lingering ache remained in her heart. He hadn't just cheated on her, he had stolen from the future she thought they were building. By noon, she had systematically frozen his access to their joint personal accounts, moving every dime she was legally entitled to into a private trust. She didn't touch the company money. Yet, she wasn't a thief, she was an executioner, and she did things by the book. At 1 o'clock, Crystal walked into the polished, intimidating glass lobby of the city's most ruthless family law firm. Her lawyer, a sharply dressed woman named Evelyn, who looked like she ate cheating husbands for breakfast, flipped through the thick folder of documents Crystal had printed out. "Well," Evelyn murmured, adjusting her designer glasses, "he's been a very busy boy, and a very stupid one. You have the structural blueprints to completely dismantle his life." "Crystal, I don't just want half Evelyn," Crystal said, her voice deadpan and steady. "I want the intellectual property rights to the core algorithm. I wrote the foundational code before we even got married. I want the house. I want him to leave with nothing but the lint in his pockets." Evelyn smiled, a slow, predatory curve of her lips. "I love a woman who knows what she wants. We serve the papers on Friday." Leaving the law firm, Crystal felt lighter than she had in years. The heavy, suffocating cloak of being David's wife was already slipping off her shoulders. She decided to treat herself to lunch at an upscale bistro nearby, craving a proper meal after a morning fueled entirely by vengeance and black coffee. She was sitting at a corner table, quietly reviewing a printed spreadsheet of David's asset transfers, when a shadow fell across her table. "I know that look. That's the look you used to get right before you destroyed someone in a debate tournament." Crystal looked up. Standing there was Derek. He was older now, but the years had been incredibly kind to him. The college boy with the messy hair and a sketchbook was gone. In his place stood a man in his mid-30s, wearing a bespoke navy suit that screamed quiet wealth. Derek owned one of the most prestigious modern art galleries on the East Coast. He was sophisticated, subtly dangerous, and possessed a pair of piercing, intelligent eyes that always made Crystal feel like he could read her mind. "Derek," she breathed, genuinely surprised. "It has been a long time, too long," he agreed, smoothly sliding into the chair across from her without asking for permission. He signaled the waiter for 2 glasses of Pinot Noir. He glanced down at the spreadsheet she hastily tried to cover with a napkin. He didn't pry, but his gaze sharpened. He leaned in close, the faint, intoxicating scent of bergamot and old paper reaching her. "If you are burying a body, Crystal," he murmured, his voice a low, teasing baritone. "I have a very large backyard." Crystal let out a startled, genuine laugh. It was the first real laugh she'd had in days. "I might take you up on that." Derek's eyes softened, lingering on her face. "You look beautiful, Crystal, but you also look like you are going to war." He reached out, his fingers lightly brushing the edge of the documents on the table. "Whatever it is, you don't have to fight it alone." if you need a safe harbor or just a place to plot your world domination. My gallery is always open to you." The offer wasn't just polite small talk. It was a lifeline grounded in a deep, unspoken respect that David had never shown her. Crystal looked at Derek, truly looking at him, and for the first time she realized that the world beyond her broken marriage was vast, full of possibilities. And suddenly, very intriguing. War first, she reminded herself, her eyes glinting as she raised her newly poured glass of wine to clink against his. Crystal didn't believe in confronting the other woman in a fit of hysterical rage. Pulling hair and throwing drinks in public spaces was for amateurs and reality television stars. Crystal was a professional, and to a professional, a mistress wasn't a romantic rival. She was a business problem that required a swift, calculated solution. Her private investigator had delivered Mia Harper's full dossier within 48 hours. Mia was 22, an aspiring influencer who supplemented her meager social media income by latching onto wealthy, older men. She wasn't a villain out of a fairy tale, maliciously plotting to destroy a marriage. She was just a pragmatic, ambitious girl looking for a fast pass to the top floor, which meant she had a price. Crystal sent a discreet, untraceable message arranging a meeting at an exclusive, members-only tea room on the Upper East Side. It was the kind of place where the silence was expensive and the waitstaff seemed to glide over the plush carpets. Mia arrived exactly 5 minutes late, wearing a designer trench coat that Crystal knew for a fact had been charged to David's secondary platinum card. She looked nervous but defiant, her chin tilted up in a defensive posture as she slid into the velvet booth across from Crystal. "If you're here to yell at me to stay away from your husband," Mia started, her voice defensive, trying to sound much tougher than she looked. "David already told me you guys are basically separated. He said you sleep in different rooms." Crystal didn't blink. She took a slow sip of her Earl Grey, savoring the bergamot. "David snores, Mia, and he leaves wet towels on the floor. If you want to share a room with him full-time, you have my deepest sympathies." Mia faltered, her rehearsed speech dying in her throat. She had clearly prepared for a weeping, angry housewife, not this icy, impeccably composed woman who looked at her not with hatred, but with mild amusement. "I didn't bring you here to fight over a man whose best days are behind him," Crystal said, her voice smooth and conversational. She reached into her Hermes tote and pulled out a slim, pristine white envelope. She slid it across the marble table. "I brought you here to make an investment." Mia frowned, her eyes darting from Crystal to the envelope. Cautiously, she picked it up and peeked inside. Her eyes went comically wide, all pretense of sophistication evaporating. It was a cashier's check. The number written on it had enough zeros to make someone choke on their own saliva. "This is a lot of money," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft clinking of teacups in the room. "It's enough to set you up comfortably in Los Angeles," Crystal said, leaning back in her chair. "It's enough to buy that influencer lifestyle you've been faking on Instagram. The car he bought you, keep it. But the penthouse is in his name, and my lawyers will freeze it by Friday. You'll be locked out before the weekend." Mia swallowed hard, staring at the check as if it were a winning lottery ticket. "What do you want? Loyalty is a luxury, Mia, and David's checkbook is about to bounce," Crystal said, her tone hardening just enough to let the steel show through. "I know he keeps a backup ledger of his private entertainment expenses on his personal laptop at your apartment. He's too paranoid to keep it at our house. I want that laptop, and I want you to disappear immediately." I love a woman who understands that a mistress is rarely a homewrecker and almost always a contractor. Crystal doesn't waste energy on a cat fight, she approaches Mia with a buyout offer. She recognizes that the girl is simply a mirror for David's vanity, an influencer who can be influenced by a larger check. By paying Mia to flip on David, Crystal isn't just getting a laptop, she's proving that everything David built, including his romance, is transactional. It's clean, it's cold, and it's a brilliant redistribution of assets. If you're going to be betrayed with your own money, the least you can do is use that money to buy the evidence. Mia looked at Crystal, a sudden glimmer of profound respect in her young eyes. She didn't hesitate for more than 5 seconds. She folded the check, slipped it into her bag, and nodded. I can get you the laptop tonight, and I've always hated the winters here anyway. Pleasure doing business with you, Crystal smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile. With the final piece of the puzzle secured, Crystal spent the next few days finalizing her exit strategy. She found herself spending her afternoons in Derek's gallery. True to his word, Derek had cleared out a bright, sunlit loft space above the main exhibition floor, offering it to her as a temporary design studio. Being around Derek was like breathing clean air after years of inhaling smog. He didn't demand her attention. He simply offered his presence. He would bring her lunch, look at her preliminary design sketches, and offer sharp, insightful critiques that respected her talent. He looked at her like she was a masterpiece, not a domestic appliance. "You're glowing," Derek noted one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe of her studio, watching her arrange fabric swatches. "Vengeance suits you." "It's remarkably good for the complexion," Crystal agreed, not looking up, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "David's corporate anniversary gala is tomorrow night," Derek said casually, though his eyes were sharp. "The one where he's supposed to announce the IPO. I received an invitation." "Are you going?" Crystal finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "Oh, I wouldn't miss it for the world, but I think David might find my +1 arrangement a bit disruptive." Derek's smile widened into something dangerously charming. "I'll pick you up at 7. The next evening, the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was packed with the city's tech elite, venture capitalists, and high society vultures. The air buzzed with the smell of expensive champagne and impending money. David stood on the main stage looking incredibly smug in his tailored tuxedo. He was adjusting the microphone, preparing to give the speech of his career, the announcement that his company, their company, was going public. He scanned the front row, a slight frown marring his perfect features. The 2 seats reserved for his wife and his secret girlfriend were glaringly empty. He cleared his throat, forcing his winning, charismatic smile back onto his face. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight marks the culmination of 10 years of my hard work." He didn't get to finish his sentence. Suddenly, the lights in the ballroom dimmed to pitch black. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Behind David, the massive wall-to-wall LED projector screen meant to display the company logo flickered to life. But it wasn't a logo that appeared. It was high-definition video footage of a familiar face in a high-end jewelry store, slipping a massive emerald-cut diamond onto the finger of a very young, very blonde girl. And then the audio kicked in, loud and echoing through the state of the art sound system. "If I put this on my wife, it would just look like glass. She's as bland as tap water." The ballroom descended into absolute stunned silence. The silence in the ballroom was so profound that Crystal could hear the faint, erratic buzzing of the projector. Then the whispers began. They started as a low murmur and rapidly crescendoed into a deafening roar of shocked gasps, muffled laughter, and frantic speculation. On stage, David looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. His mouth hung open, his face drained of all color, and his eyes darted wildly around the room as if searching for a reset button. But the nightmare wasn't over. The video on the screen seamlessly transitioned. It wasn't just the jewelry store anymore. It was a sterile black and white spreadsheet. The audio changed from David's arrogant purr to a clear, crisp voice, reading out dates, account numbers, and sums of money. Transfer of company operational funds, $500,000 to personal offshore account. Purpose: real estate down payment. The voice belonged to Mia. Crystal had made sure the girl earned every penny of her payout. The whispers in the room morphed into shouts of outrage. The venture capitalists in the front row, the men who held the purse strings to David's impending IPO, were standing up, their faces red with fury. Embezzlement was the one sin the tech world never forgave. "Turn it off," David shrieked, his voice cracking as he fumbled blindly with the podium cables. "Somebody turn that damn thing off. It is a deep fake. It is AI." But the tech crew had been very generously compensated to take a sudden, extended smoke break. Just as the chaos reached its peak, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A spotlight previously commanded by the missing tech crew suddenly swiveled and locked onto the entrance. There stood Crystal. She wasn't wearing the muted, conservative pastels David preferred her to wear so she wouldn't overshadow him. She was wearing a breathtaking, backless crimson gown that clung to her curves and flared at the hem, making her look like a drop of fresh blood on a snowfield. Her hair was swept up in an elegant, modern twist, and her makeup was flawless, highlighting the sharp, predatory gleam in her eyes. Beside her, radiating quiet, lethal authority, was Derek. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, his hand resting lightly but possessively on the small of her back. They looked like royalty descending upon a peasant uprising. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Crystal walked down the center aisle, the click of her heels cutting through the uproar. She didn't look angry. She looked completely and utterly bored. She reached the base of the stage and looked up at David. He was trembling, sweat beading on his forehead, his charismatic facade completely shattered. "Crystal," he choked out, his eyes pleading. "Crystal, what is this? Tell them it is a lie." Crystal didn't raise her voice, but she spoke clearly into the stunned quiet of the room. "I told you years ago, David, that if you ever stole from the company, you'd burn it to the ground. I just didn't realize you were using the kindling to buy shiny rocks for teenagers." She pulled a thick manila envelope from Derek's hand and tossed it onto the stage. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thwack, right at David's feet. "Those are the divorce papers," Crystal announced, her voice carrying the crisp authority of a judge handing down a sentence. "And formal notification from my legal team. As the original architect of the proprietary algorithm, I am pulling my 40% equity and all intellectual property rights effective immediately. You don't have a company anymore, David. You have a very expensive empty shell." David stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb. "You can't do this," he whispered, stepping back. "You are my wife. You built this with me." "I built it for you," Crystal corrected, her eyes colder than absolute zero. "And now I'm taking it back. Enjoy your tap water." She didn't wait for his response. She turned on her heel, her crimson dress swirling around her. Derek offered his arm, a small, proud smile playing on his lips. She took it, and together they walked out of the ballroom, leaving David screaming in the background as furious investors swarmed the stage. The fallout was catastrophic and instantaneous. By Monday, the board of directors had ousted David as CEO. The SEC was opening an investigation into the embezzled funds. His old money mother, who had spent years telling Crystal she wasn't good enough, was suddenly facing the reality of losing her ancestral home to cover her son's legal fees. David was a drowning man, and the water was rising fast. A week later, the city was hit by a torrential downpour. Crystal was standing in the expansive living room of her new ultra-modern apartment overlooking the skyline. She was sketching a new design concept, feeling a profound sense of peace. The intercom buzzed. It was the building's concierge. "Miss Harper, there is a gentleman downstairs. He is soaking wet and insists on seeing you. He says he is your husband." Crystal sighed, setting down her pencil. "Tell him I don't have a husband, and tell security to remove him if he doesn't leave." She walked over to the floor, to ceiling window, and looked down at the street below. Through the sheets of rain, she could see David standing by the curb. He looked pathetic, his designer suit ruined, his hair plastered to his forehead. He was shouting something up at her window, looking like a desperate stray dog. Just then, a sleek black Maybach pulled up to the curb, splashing water onto David's expensive leather shoes. The back door opened, and an umbrella emerged, but it wasn't a driver who stepped out. It was Derek. Crystal watched as Derek walked calmly around the car. He didn't look at David. He didn't even acknowledge his existence. Derek simply stood under the umbrella, waiting. Crystal smiled. She grabbed her coat, rode the elevator down, and walked out through the lobby doors. David saw her and immediately lunged forward, his face contorted with desperation. "Crystal, please, you have to talk to me. I lost everything. My mother is sick. The company is gone." He didn't get within 3 feet of her. Derek stepped smoothly between them, the umbrella shielding Crystal entirely. He looked down at David with a gaze so devoid of warmth, it was almost terrifying. "Step back," Derek said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is between me and my wife," David screamed, swiping water from his eyes. "You are just some guy she is using to make me jealous." Crystal stepped out slightly from behind Derek, looking at the man she used to love. She felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, just a profound emptiness. "David," she said softly, "you need to leave before you embarrass yourself any further." "I love you," he sobbed, actually dropping to his knees on the wet pavement. "I swear to God, Crystal, I love you. That girl meant nothing. You are the only woman I've ever truly loved. We have 10 years together. You can't just throw that away." Crystal stared at him, at the pathetic, ruined man sobbing in the dirt. "You are right," she said slowly. "We had 10 years, but you threw them away the moment you decided my loyalty was a weakness." She turned to Derek, her expression softening instantly. "Let's go home." Derek nodded, shooting David one last dismissive look. "Roll away, David. Don't dirty my fiancé's shoes." He wrapped a protective arm around Crystal's waist, guiding her into the warm, dry interior of the car. As they drove away, Crystal looked in the rearview mirror. David was still kneeling in the rain, a broken, forgotten man. Crystal leaned her head on Derek's shoulder, closing her eyes. The past was finally dead. The divorce was finalized with the brutal efficiency of a corporate liquidation. Crystal didn't just walk away with what was hers. Her legal team performed a financial autopsy on David. Between the embezzlement charges, the frozen offshore accounts, and the intellectual property Crystal rightfully clawed back, David wasn't just broke. He was radioactive. No venture capitalist would touch him, and the high society circles that once eagerly accepted his mother's invitations now treated the family name like a bad rash. The sprawling suburban estate, the physical manifestation of David's fragile ego, was sold at auction to cover his mounting legal debts. His mother, stripped of her perceived superiority, was forced to move into a modest condo 2 states over, entirely dependent on a meager pension. Crystal, meanwhile, was flourishing. She hadn't just survived the explosion, she had harnessed the energy to launch herself higher. The loft space Derek had provided transformed into a bustling, highly sought-after interior design firm. Without David's constant, subtle belittling weighing her down, Crystal's creativity exploded. She was booking high-end commercial spaces, her name circulating in the same elite circles that had once ignored her. More importantly, the dynamic between her and Derek was shifting into something profound and intoxicating. It wasn't a frantic, desperate rebound. It was a slow, deliberate burn. Derek didn't try to fix her. He recognized she wasn't broken. He offered her a partnership based on absolute equality. They spent evenings in his gallery after hours, drinking wine while she sketched, and he analyzed auction catalogs. He remembered how she took her coffee without being told. He asked for her opinion on contemporary art acquisitions. And when he looked at her, it was with a heavy, simmering heat that made Crystal realize what she had been starved of for the past 10 years. One evening, about 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Crystal was working late in her studio. Derek walked in, carrying 2 boxes of high-end takeout. "You need to eat," he said, setting the boxes on her drafting table. He moved behind her, his large, warm hands gently massaging the tension out of her shoulders. "You are going to burn yourself out, Crystal." She leaned back into his touch, letting out a long breath. "I am just finalizing the pitch for the new boutique hotel. It has to be perfect." "It already is," Derek murmured, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss to the side of her neck. His breath was warm against her skin. "You are brilliant. You don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore, especially not to yourself." Crystal closed her eyes, a sudden wave of affection washing over her. "You know, David used to tell me my designs were cute hobbies to keep me busy." Derek's hands stopped moving. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David was an idiot who couldn't recognize a masterpiece if it was hanging right in front of him. He turned her chair around so she was facing him. His dark eyes were intense, stripping away any pretense. "I don't see a hobbyist, Crystal. I see a powerhouse. I see the woman I've wanted since I was 20 years old." The confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Crystal looked at the man before her, steady, strong, completely transparent in his devotion. She reached up, cupping his jaw, and pulled him down into a kiss that tasted like a promise. It was deep, hungry, and entirely devoid of the toxic anxiety that had defined her past. They were celebrating the successful launch of her firm the following Friday. Derek had rented out the entire top floor of a chic downtown restaurant. The room was filled with investors, art collectors, and friends who had watched Crystal rise from the ashes. Crystal stood by the floor, to ceiling windows, wearing a sleek, tailored white pantsuit that screamed power and elegance. She was laughing at a joke Derek had just whispered in her ear when a sudden commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. The heavy glass doors burst open, and a figure stumbled into the room, shoving past a bewildered hostess. It was David. The room went dead silent. The contrast between the glamorous crowd and the man standing in the doorway was jarring. David was unkempt, his face unshaven and haggard. He wore a rumpled jacket that looked like it hadn't been dry, cleaned in months. He reeked of cheap whiskey and desperation. He locked eyes with Crystal across the room, and a twisted, drunken smile spread across his face. "There she is," David slurred, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet space. He stumbled forward, ignoring the disgusted stares of the elite crowd. The woman of the hour, celebrating your big success, huh? Built on the ruins of my life. Two security guards immediately moved in, but Crystal held up a hand, stopping them. She didn't shrink back, she didn't look to Derek for protection. Though he had immediately stepped to her side, his body tense and ready to intervene. Crystal stepped forward, her posture impeccable, her face a mask of absolute calm. "David," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel, "you are trespassing and you are drunk." "I am drunk because of you," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You took everything from me. You manipulated the board, you stole my company, you left me with nothing. And now you are parading around with this gallery boy, acting like you are some kind of queen." A collective murmur of disgust went through the room. Derek took a step forward, his jaw tight, but Crystal placed a gentle hand on his chest, holding him back. "I didn't steal anything, David," Crystal said, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. "I simply stopped letting you steal from me. I stopped doing your work, fixing your mistakes, and smiling while you handed my future over to teenagers." David flinched, the reality of his public humiliation finally seeming to penetrate his drunken haze. "I loved you," he choked out, the anger suddenly collapsing into pathetic sobbing. "I made a mistake, Crystal, one mistake, and you threw away 10 years, you ruined me." "No, David," Crystal replied, her voice soft but entirely merciless. "You ruined yourself. You thought I was your safety net, your foundation. You forgot that if you pull the foundation out from under a house, the house collapses." She looked at him, truly looking at the man she had once promised to spend her life with. There was no love left, no anger, not even pity, just the absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. "I didn't ruin you," she repeated, her eyes meeting his. "I just stopped holding you up. And look how quickly you fell." This is the foundation law. For 10 years, Crystal was the invisible scaffolding holding up David's ego, his company, and his social standing. The moment she stepped away, he didn't just stumble, he disintegrated. David's public breakdown, the drinking, the trespassing, the blaming, is the classic tantrum of a parasite who has lost its host. He calls her a monster because she stopped being a martyr. But Crystal's response is the ultimate weight of truth. She didn't have to destroy him. She simply stopped providing the structural support he never bothered to build for himself. When a woman finally drops the rope, the man who was leaning on it doesn't just fall. He hits the floor hard. David stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, unable to find a single word of defense. He looked around the room, seeing nothing but cold, judging. He was a ghost haunting a world that had completely moved on without him. Crystal turned to the security guards. "Please escort Mr. Harper out. He was just leaving." The guards moved in, grabbing David by the arms. He didn't fight them. He just kept staring at Crystal as he was dragged backward toward the elevator, his face a portrait of total, devastating defeat. When the doors finally closed, the tension in the room snapped. A smattering of applause broke out, quickly growing into genuine cheers. Derek turned to her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of pride and intense desire. "Have I mentioned how terrifyingly brilliant you are?" Crystal smiled, finally allowing herself to relax. She took her champagne glass from the nearby table and raised it. "You might have mentioned it once or twice, but I don't mind hearing it again." The past was ashes, and Crystal was ready to build something entirely new. The morning after the party, the city awoke to a crisp, brilliant blue sky, the kind that made the glass skyscrapers look like they were carved from ice. Crystal stood in the kitchen of her new apartment, humming softly as she poured 2 cups of coffee strong. Black, no sugar, exactly how she liked it, and exactly how Derek liked it. She turned around just as Derek emerged from the bedroom, wearing a pair of low-slung sweatpants and nothing else. His hair was sleek, tousled, a stark contrast to the meticulously groomed gallery owner the world saw, and his eyes were already locked onto her with that familiar, simmering heat. He crossed the kitchen, took the coffee mug from her hand, set it on the counter, and pulled her flush against his chest. "Good morning, powerhouse," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep, kissing the crook of her neck. "Good morning," Crystal smiled, looping her arms around his waist. "Did you sleep well?" "I slept perfectly," Derek replied, pulling back just enough to look her in the eyes, "because for the first time in my life, I woke up exactly where I am supposed to be." The sincerity in his voice made Crystal's breath hitch. There were no games with Derek, no hidden ledgers, no gaslighting, no treating her like an accessory. He loved her fiercely, openly, and with a profound respect that still occasionally took her breath away. Over the next few weeks, the final remnants of David's existence faded from the city's elite circles, like a bad stain finally washed out. Gossip columns briefly mentioned the spectacular implosion of his tech company, now officially filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Before moving on to the next scandal, someone mentioned they saw him working at a mid-tier electronics store out in the suburbs, trying to sell extended warranties to teenagers, but Crystal didn't care enough to verify. He was a closed chapter, a very expensive lesson in knowing her own worth. Crystal's design firm, however, was soaring. Her bold, elegant aesthetic was in high demand. She was no longer David's wife, the hobbyist. She was Crystal, the visionary. One Friday evening, Derek asked her to meet him at the gallery after closing. When Crystal arrived, the main exhibition hall was completely dark, save for a single spotlight illuminating a large canvas in the center of the room. She walked toward it, her heels clicking softly on the polished concrete floor. Derek stepped out of the shadows wearing his signature sharp suit, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "What is this?" Crystal asked, taking a glass, her eyes fixed on the covered canvas. "This," Derek said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register, "is the centerpiece for my new exhibition. But before I show the world, I needed you to see it first." He stepped forward and pulled the velvet drape away. Crystal gasped. It wasn't a painting. It was a massive, incredibly detailed architectural blueprint of a house. But it wasn't just any house. It was a modern, breathtaking design, blending sleek glass lines with warm, natural wood. It was exactly the style Crystal loved, a design she had sketched out years ago in a private notebook, a dream home she had abandoned when David insisted on buying that gaudy, soulless suburban estate to impress his mother. Derek had found her old sketches and had them professionally rendered by a master architect. Derek, Crystal breathed, reaching out to trace the lines of the blueprint, tears pricking her eyes, not tears of grief, but of profound, overwhelming joy. "I bought the land in the hills," Derek said, stepping up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. 10 acres, overlooking the valley. "It is yours, Crystal, to build, to design, to make entirely your own." He turned her around, taking the champagne glass from her hand and setting it aside. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. He didn't make a grandiose theatrical speech. He simply opened the box, revealing a stunning, vintage, sapphire ring, deep, complex, and entirely unique. "I don't want a perfect, quiet wife," Derek said, his eyes burning into hers. I want a partner. I want a woman who builds empires, who fights her own battles, and who knows exactly how extraordinary she is. Crystal, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me? Crystal looked at the man who had seen her at her lowest and never once doubted her strength. A man who didn't offer her a cage disguised as a mansion, but a blank canvas to build their future together. She didn't hesitate. Yes, she whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracking down her cheek. Yes, Derek, I will. He slipped the sapphire onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He pulled her in, kissing her with a desperate, triumphant passion that tasted like victory and a promise of 100 beautiful tomorrows. Outside, the city lights twinkled, indifferent to the drama of human lives. But inside the gallery, surrounded by art and possibility, Crystal knew she had finally crafted her own masterpiece. She had traded a cheap 3-carat cliché for something entirely priceless. Her life on her own terms, with a man who loved her exactly as she was. Let's have a seat in the velvet chair and discuss the tap water trap. Society has a bad habit of rewarding supportive wives with a pat on the head and a one-way ticket to irrelevance. We are told to be the wind beneath their wings, only to find out they're using those wings to fly toward a younger, shinier version of what we used to be. David looked at Crystal and saw a domestic appliance. He forgot that the woman who designed his empire's logic could just as easily design its collapse. The most refreshing part of Crystal's journey isn't the vengeance, though the public IPO humiliation was a delicious touch of theater. It's the shift in her internal economy. She stopped investing in a joint future that was really just a one-way subsidy for David's ego. She took her intellectual property, her meticulous records, and her dignity, and she walked into a room where she was finally the lead architect. And as for Derek, he's the upgrade every woman deserves. A man who doesn't want a perfect, quiet wife to hide in the shadows, but a partner who challenges him. He didn't offer her a ring to save her. He offered her a blueprint for her own dream home. That is the difference between being a man's safety net and being a man's equal. David ended up exactly where he belonged, soaking wet in the rain, yelling at a skyscraper, clutching the ghost of a decade he traded for a shiny rock. Crystal ended up in the hills, building her own castle. So my question for you tonight, have you ever been treated like tap water by someone who was actually dying of thirst for your support? When did you finally realize you were the one providing the life force? And what happened when you finally shut off the tap pour? Your stories into the comments. I am reading every word. Madam Read out. Would you like me to analyze another story through Madam Read's perspective, or perhaps create a new narrative centered on a woman reclaiming her power?